and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read words. Nope, books, and other words too. Should we do that over or just let it go?
Let it go.
All right. We do read words and books. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah.
And this week we will be discussing Before the Shattered Gates of Heaven. Where'd I put it? There it is. Is that it? Did I get it right and I shouldn't have questioned myself? Yes.
You did get it right.
Before the Shattered Gates of Heaven by Bryan S. Glosemeyer. But before we start talking about that, Sarah, what's something good that happened recently?
Something good that happened recently is my copy of my Kickstarter reward hardcover of Mrs. Covington's arrived today. I haven't actually opened it because I got distracted with other things, but it arrived and I was very pleased.
Oh, wonderful. I haven't checked the mail today, so I don't know if I got mine. That's exciting. So did Lockhaven end up doing a dust jacket or no? I forget.
I think he did.
I guess, yeah, you don't actually know, huh?
Well, we did see a hardcover at his book signing or book launch party because he brought a copy.
All right.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to actually opening it tomorrow. This is kind of a pretty good thing. Well, having it arrive is a good thing too.
Do you have a place picked out on your shelves for it already?
I'm gonna have to make space on my shelf because I don't think there is space currently, but it will go next to my other copies of his books.
I was gonna say I'm quickly developing a Lockhaven shelf.
Mm-hmm. Yes, not a bad shelf to have.
Not at all. My good thing is weird work stuff, so sorry to put everyone to sleep before we start talking about fun book things.
Weird work stuff doesn't sound good, but you say it's a good thing, so I'm intrigued.
But it's weird because bringing up work stuff during the podcast just feels weird inherently.
Ah, I see.
But we have a new client that finally onboarded after a million years, and I've sort of felt unsettled. Like, they need help with advertising, which is what I do, but they are using a very specific platform that I don't have experience with, and they do have support from the platform. So I've been very uncertain if I will actually bring any value to the table. And then we had a meeting today, or I got myself invited to their meetings, their monthly meetings with platform support, and oh boy!
That bad, huh?
Yeah. Me, with zero knowledge of the platform, still being helpful. Which made me feel very good. I no longer feel like I'm swindling them out of a management fee, let's just say that.
Well, that's always a delight.
It is. This is going to sound like technobabble because it is, but their ABM was using the wrong conversion goal for optimizations. I haven't really untangled that yet. Luckily, they haven't been doing it for very long. Like, they just started 2 months ago, but ooh, that could have been bad.
I will take your word for it. What it does remind me is that we need to do that advertising episode that we said that we would do, or rather that we said you would do, because I will bring nothing to that table.
No, you will bring asking questions that a blank slate would ask, which is very important, so that when I say shit like their AMP is using the wrong conversion goal for optimization. No, I realize that is nonsense jargon. I'm using it as a joke. I'm refusing to explain it as a joke.
I think I understand most of it except for APM.
ABM. I might have misspoken. Account-based marketing. It is basically a DSP, which is what I'm familiar with, but a little bit different. DSP is a demand-side platform. Fun advertising words.
I think we're having our words are weird up front this episode.
I know. My good thing did just turn into me flexing about being good at my job, which really was my good thing to begin with. So that's nice.
Well, it's always nice to get confirmation that you're good at your job.
It really is. What are you drinking tonight, Sarah?
I'm drinking homemade lemonade with a dash of whiskey. So basically a lazy person's whiskey sour.
Delightful. Well, how sour do you make your homemade lemonade?
So I make essentially a lemon concentrate, which is 1-to-1 blend of fresh squeezed lemon juice and simple syrup. And then I can dilute that. I have that in a jar and I can dilute that however much I want. But usually I make my lemonade pretty sour
Nice.
because I like sour drinks.
Wonderful.
What are you drinking?
I am drinking a shilling cider. They're pretty local. I didn't realize they were that local, actually.
Washington brand?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're from Auburn.
Oh, okay. Not
That's
Seattle, but
basically
basically.
Seattle. I mean, if you live in Auburn, no, you would not say you live in Seattle. But if you were traveling from out of state, yeah, you would just say Seattle.
Yeah, it's like I say that I'm from the San Francisco area.
Exactly.
Well, I am from the San Francisco area, but
anyway, not the point. Fairly local.
I like Shilling, though. They make good cider.
Oh, they're good. I'm drinking the Excelsior. What would you call that? Strain? Type? Flavor?
Label?
It's the one with a fun space giraffe on the
No.
can.
I meant I would call that a label in lieu of a better word.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I understood and was now describing it. Anyway, it's very good. It's probably my favorite cider right now. Have you done any reading lately other than podcast books?
I've done a lot of reading other than podcast books, actually.
Yeah, because I pushed this episode back a million years because I was taking too long to read the book.
Partially that, also partially because I had 2 long plane rides in between in between now and our last book recording. So I've had a lot of reading time. I started a reread of Anne McCaffrey, and part of my fondness for these books, I'm sure, is nostalgia factor because I did read them when I was young. I do think that they're still enjoyable books.
So I'm sorry, Anne McCaffrey is a series?
No, Anne McCaffrey is the author. Specifically, I'm reading her Pern books, her Dragon Riders of Pern books.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And she has other books too, but they're more science fiction. And as a kid, that was never what I gravitated towards. I did stop reading the Pern books when they got too science fiction. But I think that for the most part, they still hold up. Obviously, there's a lot of very, very dated interpersonal relations and descriptions of interpersonal relations.
That'll happen.
Yeah. But given that she did write at least some of these in the 70s, I can kind of forgive her for that. I think it'd be really interesting. I really want to get her on the podcast. I mean, obviously not her as a person because she's been dead for many years, but I think it'd be fun to discuss one of her books on the podcast.
You know, I'm always down to pontificate on the finer distinctions between fantasy and science fiction.
And her Pern books are a really interesting blend because it's a highly technologically capable society that has kind of devolved over the course of centuries into a fantasy world with dragons. And we start when the world is firmly fantasy. Like, as a reader, you know, okay, there are things that came from a more advanced society, but it starts, everyone is very firmly fantasy. And then as the series progresses, they learn more and more like technologically advanced things as they rediscover stuff. So it gets more science fiction-y.
You know, that sounds an awful lot like this book I just read called Before the Shattered Gates of Heaven by Bryan S. Glosemeyer.
You're welcome for that very nice lead-in.
Yes. I mean, not really, but the merging of fantasy and sci-fi. I did have a couple of notes from early on reading this where I was like, this feels an awful lot like space fantasy. But I have revised my opinion, but I can't talk about that yet. So let's start from the top, shall we?
Yeah, I didn't get the fantasy vibes from this quite as much as it sounds like you did.
Well, that's mostly because I have weird definitions of science fiction. Not weird, highly specific.
That is true. I think your definition of science fiction is much more specific than mine is. Being
set in space is not enough. Also, the ruling class are basically demons. I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I could see that.
They have horns and multiple eyeballs. That's a demon.
Space demons, yeah.
Yeah. So, like, that was definitely the vibe I felt going into this. How do you even start from the top for this book? So much happens. The beginning is a lot.
It's definitely a lot, and it really throws you in to the world. There's a lot of terminology that you kind of just have to pick up as the story goes along.
I kind of loved that. I think the slang was in context enough that after hearing it like twice, it was very clear what was happening, and it was consistent.
Yes, I did like it, to be clear, the way that we're just thrown into the deep end here. I had a little bit of trouble with the dense world building, which is not a surprise because I tend to have more trouble with science fiction dense world building than I do with fantasy dense world building, possibly just because I'm less familiar with tropes and things like that.
I agree. Some of the parts in the beginning did glaze me over a little bit, but I feel like I didn't lose anything out of that. Like, again, there were enough context clues in the prose that I was still able to follow along, even if I didn't fully process a very dense paragraph.
Yeah, and I do think that me having trouble with some of the upfront world building was a personal problem and not necessarily a book problem.
I think it's just hard for brains to grasp things that are too abstract right off the bat.
Possibly.
I think that's pretty normal. That's not why I was saying the beginning was rough, though. So this book takes place in a very distant future, as the back of the book says. I actually think the back of the book is extremely accurate.
Did you read the back of the book?
After I read the book, yeah.
Okay, but we have read some books where you have not read the back of the book at any point prior to our recording.
Honestly, I was mostly curious. So, all right, backstory. Humans are a slave race to their demon overlords. They're not demons, they're aliens. They're demons. And they don't get names unless they prove themselves. And I was very curious how the back of the book handled that. And I was a little disappointed that it just calls our main character Sabira, even though the back of the book is mostly describing the events that happen before she gets her name. And I get why. You can't just say the girl. But the fact that the prose referred to her only as the girl for the first couple of chapters was very effective.
Yeah. I mean, like I really liked a lot of how Glosemeyer brings us into the world and the setting.
I hated every minute of it because the world is brutal.
Well, yeah, it's not pleasant.
But I mean, it was very well done. I didn't hate every minute of it. It was just abrasive.
It's definitely hard to read because this world is so brutal, and we're basically experience things through. It's not first person perspective, but we're learning all about things as Sabira goes through it, or the girl as she is at this point in time. And it's so uncomfortable because, like, as the reader, you can be like, nah, dude, this girl is brainwashed. This is not a great society. Things are super, super, super wrong. But she doesn't know that. So she talks about it like it's the best thing since sliced bread, that she's going to go and fight and become someone who has a name.
A real person. They basically have to prove themselves worthy of personhood, which is a very effective way of pointing out how fucked up that is, and personhood is an inherent right.
Yes.
That's the type of thing that pushed me over from space fantasy into sci-fi for this book. And some of the commentary gets a little bit on the nose, but overall, just the very spirit of the story points out, I would say that in particular, so brutally well.
Yes.
But I will say, and this is where we should probably mention, Bryan's a friend of the show. Or I should at least say I recognize his name from Instagram comments, which really saved the beginning of this book for me, because I haven't read anything else by him. This is the first book of a series. Is this his first novel?
So this was actually a collection of 4 novellas that he published separately originally, and then collected into one, like, novel, is my understanding.
The front of the book says Shattered Gates Volume 1.
Yes, there's a second one.
Okay.
But I think that the 4 parts in this book were originally published separately.
Okay. Where I was going with that is that I haven't read his other work. And normally, if I was approaching a book this intense, I would be a little worried that the author wouldn't follow through on what they... If they're not setting it up, then they really ought to be. The dehumanization at the beginning is very difficult to swallow, and you kind of have to because it goes on for a long time. And you're trying to root for a main character who is entrenched in this system. But I've seen the types of comments that Bryan leaves on Instagram, which it sounds terrible out of context. He's a very thoughtful person. So I was like, I know he's going somewhere with this. Like, he has to be. And I was right, he was. But I don't know if I could have gotten through the beginning without having some kind of trust. Listeners, trust us to vouch for him. He's going somewhere with this. But if I hadn't had that in the back of my head, I don't think I could have gotten through the first part. It is intense.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think I probably still would have, even if we had no connection whatsoever, and we had just picked this book at random, off of the shelves at a bookstore and picked it up. I think that the dehumanization is so strongly present that I probably would have thought that the author had a plan for that.
I've read some books that have fucked that up hard enough that I'm just always nervous.
That's fair.
Not with that in particular, but when there's a we'll say problematic theme that is so prevalent that you think, well, they must be doing something interesting with this, right? And then they don't.
There are some books that do not follow through on their promise of dealing with premises like this.
There's a level of, if not trust, then hope or belief that the author is going to go somewhere. And if I don't have that faith in the author, then even if it does get to that point, the process of getting there is less enjoyable because I'm on that nervous knife's edge the whole time.
That's totally valid and fair. I think I tend to have more faith or hope that the author is going somewhere than you do.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of religious zealotry and warmongering religious zealotry, which is very hard to read, and it gets dealt with very well eventually. I mean, it's dealt with well the whole time, but it is examined thoughtfully and some extreme xenophobia. I think once it got to the xenophobia, I was like, even if I hadn't had some familiarity with Bryan, I would have gone, all right. It would have been comically over the top for it to just be going steady. I guess it reminded me a little bit of, what's the name of that movie? You've probably never seen it, but it's important. Starship Troopers.
I have seen Starship Troopers a long time ago.
Apparently, there are people who didn't realize that that's a parody, which is horrifying of its own. But the beginning reminded me of Starship Troopers in that completely engaged with the propaganda. You just have to sink your mindset into this and roll with it. And it's a lot, but it's worth it. This book brings you to some very low lows, some very extreme lows emotionally, and then reels you back in. And it is very engaging. I loved it. I think very early on you texted me, oh, you're gonna like this.
Yes, I did. I think I had read maybe the first 50 pages and I was like, oh, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a Lilly book. I enjoyed it. It was less my kind of novel, which is not to say anything about the quality, just more reader mismatch. But I did still enjoy reading it. It was just a little more difficult for me to get through.
There's a lot of graphic violence. There's, like we said, some pretty horrifying dehumanization and xenophobia. There's some extremely questionable sex as far as a consent perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot of dubious consent. Dubious in the sense that can the people who are having sex really consent some of them can't at all, but some of the less dubious sex is still, in my opinion, dubiously consensual.
There's the dubious consent, and then there's also the uncomfortable power dynamics, which falls under the same umbrella but is a specific conversation. And there is the idea that this is a different society, and so maybe sex just is that different. there's a lot happening. I was trying to just bring up all the triggers before we got to the spoiler section. And then I got distracted. So, right off the bat, you should read this book if you're okay with encountering those topics in a book that knows it's doing that. Like, none of those things are accidental in any way. And to me, that makes a world of difference.
I mean, I do think it does because Glosemeyer is exploring a lot of these concepts and actually dealing with them. You're not reading a book that treats all of that as okay or just the way things are. But up front in the first, like, maybe 2/3 of the book, there's a lot of that where the reader recognizes that things are bad, but the characters don't necessarily.
Yeah, the reader and the book do. I feel like a lot of this book is staring into your soul and saying, so how does that make you feel? Which in between high adrenaline action sequences is a lot to process.
Yeah.
Well, I got a lot of weird notes for us to get into in the spoiler section. Oh, I did have one very silly side comment. My note about the religious zealotry was in reference to a quote on page 69. And Daniel saw my notebook sitting out today, and he added his own comment to that comment, which was noise. I told him he could only do that if it was fair game to mention on the show, and he was like, duh, so I had to.
Never change, Danny.
Yeah. We didn't really get into who should read this book. We just talked about warnings.
You should read this book if you want. Does this count as space opera? I feel like it might count as space opera.
Yeah, in that there are multiple civilizations sort of interacting with each other, which is sort of the only definition of space opera that I have managed to
Cobble together.
Yeah. Nobody's singing, so it can't be an opera.
No, but that does remind me of the book Space Opera by Catherine Valente, which is poking fun at Eurovision in space. It was a bit of a letdown, but great premise. This is not like that at all.
This is too personal to be a space opera. Like, there are intergalactic politics, but most of it really is, how do these societies and the push and pull between these cultures that have been at war affect very personal individual people who are people? Controversial statement for in this book.
In this book, that is a very controversial statement.
The whole point of the book is that they are people, but the characters in the book,
in the society that they come from, it's a controversial statement. That's what I mean.
I feel like we have to be really careful in, like, poking fun or satirizing the horrifying society and not attributing any of that to Glosemeyer, who, like, is clearly building that society to be horrifying on purpose.
Yes.
Which is much better than an accidentally horrifying society, like, Earth.
None of that, though, addresses who should read this book.
Oh, yeah. All right. If you can deal with some intense shit, and if you like sci-fi that uses the story and the setting to address some real-world conversations about personhood and, frankly, the meaning of life, which is a silly phrase to say out loud. And I think the book does a very good job of exploring the questions without claiming it has an answer. Very explicitly, never does it claim it has an answer. None of the characters do. Well, a lot of the characters do, but they're all assholes. And at that, we really have to get to the spoiler section before I do something terrible.
Okay, let's go.
To avoid spoilers, skip to 5636.
Okay, so we haven't talked about Daguerre.
Daguerre?
Yeah, I have no idea how her name is supposed to be pronounced.
Well, it's just the lady version of the word dagger. So it has to be Daguerre, but there's an I in it. I don't know.
Yeah. So
I think Daguerre.
I'm gonna say Daguerre, who is Sabira's, like, initially they're very antagonistic. Then they have a lot of sex and have kind of a relationship.
They're enemies to lovers.
They are enemies to lovers.
If those 2 chapters had been 80% of the book and the other stuff had been 10% on either side, this would have been a romance novel for the ages.
except they're enemies to lovers back to enemies.
I know. I really want to read the second half of this.
We should add it to the schedule.
Honestly, I was hesitant until I found out that there was only one more book, and now I'm like, yes, let's do that. If it was 8 books until infinity, then no.
It's a lot easier to add one more book to the podcast schedule than it is to add 7. It's true.
Yeah. But I do really need to know what happens because the
way that their relationship ebbs and flows is just excellent. But most of my notes, because as I think I've said on the podcast before, I'm not a particularly heavy note taker. Most of my notes go, "Oh no, Daguerre's dead." Sad face. "Oh wait, she's not dead after all. Oh no, maybe she really is dead this time. Wait, no, old again." Which I thought was a lot of fun. And then she is not dead by the end of the book.
It's an emotional roller coaster that I feel like I'm trivializing it. But I said it. This book brings you to real low lows. And then when you get the successes, they just feel euphoric.
Are there enough successes to... I guess the very end is kind of a success, but it's a measured success.
I'm thinking specifically of... Oh, well, we're in the spoiler section. This is a real big spoiler. Sabira has been rescued/kidnapped by a freedom faction of humans. She's gone through the de-brainwashing is not the word. Deprogramming. She's gone through the deprogramming process. And then, when they're about to leave for safety, they get taken back by the slavers, by the theocracy. And she's still kind of tripping on space mushrooms, which we'll talk about in a minute. Everything is terrible. She sees everyone die in front of her. And then suddenly, Orion, the tech guru who holograms himself around, shows up in front of her and says, "Hey, yes, things are bad. They're not that bad. I'm coming for you. Hold on." And in that moment, I had to put the book down. I was so glad that Orion showed up.
Yeah, but things just get bad again.
It wasn't even that. That's the point. It's not that there's really low lows and really high highs. It's that the lows are so low that just saying, "Hey, yes, you are imprisoned, but, you might not die.
And going to have to kill your friends."
Yeah. Felt like a high. That's how extreme the lows were.
I didn't quite feel that sense of euphoria. I wish I had.
Oh, I was so happy when he showed up. That was I
was happy when he showed up, but maybe not. It didn't feel like a relief because I knew there were pages left in the book and things hadn't been bad enough for them to just get away scot-free. Or rather, I didn't think this was the kind of book where they would get away scot-free. And indeed, it was not.
I was on the other side of it. Because it said Volume 1 on the front, I thought, oh, this is going to get dragged out forever. This book is going to end with Sabira getting reprogrammed and be just going back to the bad side. Great. That's where I thought it was going. Because then that would be an incredible, emotional cliffhanger. You have to buy book 2 for her to actually be rescued. Glosemeyer didn't do that to us, which I'm thankful for. So maybe that's what I was cheering.
That would make sense too. I think Glosemeyer has more sense than to try to hook us with that kind of cheap emotional trick.
Which is good, but like I said, I haven't read any of his work. I don't know.
Fair.
So space mushrooms, huh?
Space mushrooms, yes. I liked the space mushrooms. I did kind of think that they deprogrammed Sabira too easily because she basically gets deprogrammed with space mushrooms. And we were talking a little bit about this before recording, and you made the point that a lot of her programming is chemical in nature, or at least it's heavily implied that it's chemical in nature. But there's still the culture that she grew up in, which I think should have had a little more pushback than just, here, have some space mushrooms 3 nights in a row, and now your perspective is completely switched.
I have 2 rebuttals to that. One, her culture was bad.
Her culture was bad. Yeah,
So,
yes.
Again, I don't know. Obviously, that's silly and reductionist, but when you're that miserable in your heart. But no, I think the real answer is that she wasn't fully deprogrammed. She wanted to be, and so she leaned into it. But she does still have in the back of her head, it's called like the shard of her previous self, like nagging at her. Her conscience is basically the bad guy.
I guess just that felt too much like a separation. Like, because she didn't term it her conscience or anything like that. She always called it the shard. So it felt more separate, like it's this alternate personality that she has in her head. And that didn't quite work for me. Like I wanted that to be a little more integrated, for her to struggle a little more with it, to have more of an internal struggle than a kind of external struggle like that felt.
I get that. That might have been why I was expecting the book to end with her getting pulled back, because it felt too easy. So maybe I was there with you, but more okay with it. I think the struggle came not from her deprogramming, but from having to confront Dagira, who has not gone through that, right? So Dagira is in a coma while Sabira is going through her deprogramming. And she wakes up at the very end, and Sabira tries to talk to her, and they're clearly just so suddenly on different levels, which is heartbreaking. And Sabira sort of has to deal with, like, her person does not understand her on a fundamental level anymore. And that's a lot.
Yeah, it was really hard.
So I think there were enough consequences that it balanced out.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. It didn't feel like enough for me personally, but like I do think you have a point. But I also, at the end, Dagira goes off on her own instead of staying with the theocracy. And it feels like she wasn't deprogrammed enough to do that.
I didn't think she was leaving the theocracy. I thought she was leaving the literal sinking ship.
Possibly.
She chose not to kill Sabira, which is definitely a step to deprogramming. But I thought she was just like, I'm going to choose to let you live, which in of itself is wild. But she's also not going to die on a spaceship that's getting blown out of the air. Like, that would be pointless.
It seemed to me that because of how they had been programmed and trained to be the soldiers in this war, it would have made more sense if she had stayed on the ship to find other people to leave en masse, basically, rather than on her own. But I could be convinced by your reading. I guess we'll have to see what happens when we read book 2.
The conclusion of Sabira and Dagira's relationship, which, okay, I do have to say the name Dagira does not get me.
I mean, I don't think it's concluded.
It's not concluded. That conclusion is what I am so excited for in book 2. Volume 2.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, volume 2, book 2, same thing.
Yeah. I do have to say, I made a note and then the book brought it up, so then I didn't feel clever for making the note about how even once a human earns a name, it's still just the name of a tool. Like, they're still not people. Sabira's grandfather, who we see quite a bit in this book, is named Spear. So he's still not a person. He's still just a weapon.
I mean, Sabira is Saber.
Yeah, and then where I'm going with that is Dagira did not do it for me. Sabira, I was okay with. Dagira, That's a little She-Ra. Like Castaspella? Okay.
Is there really a character named Castaspella?
Hell yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And in that it's silly. And in this, Dagira like took me out of it. I preferred it when she was called Dags. I was like, that I can live with.
I liked Dags as a nickname. I didn't mind Dagira as a name because it was like it would have been a little silly, I think, if it had only been the one character. But because it was consistent, I was like, okay, this is just that's fine.
Yeah, fair enough. So, sex is real weird in this book.
As we've talked about, yes.
But now we can actually talk about it. It's introduced with pillows who are not humans, they're just pillows. Horrifying. Whose duty is just to provide sex to workers who do a good job. And the pillows clearly don't have a say in it. Well, they quote unquote chose to become pillows theoretically, but it was like that or possibly die in combat. So, like you said, not really a choice.
Yeah, not a choice. And they don't have any say over who they have sex with.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that they have consent at all. The first one we see is literally like cattle prodded into a bedroom. But then also the victors or the workers being rewarded don't really have a say either. We see Sabira, she had just become Sabira, I guess. She had just won her name. She has sort of an internal monologue that she's not really feeling like having sex, but well, she's getting this sex worker sent to her room, so she guesses she has to show that she's grateful. Also horrifying.
Neither party can really consent at all.
Oh, yeah. But I think what bothered me the most was once she got assigned to her, like, military troop, they have this ceremony where everyone gets to choose to either, like, spar or fuck someone else in the troop. And this was interesting. You have a comment because Sabira's whole goal is, like, she really wants to fuck her boss. That's like her big thing for a couple of chapters. And then when she like messes up at work, she's like, no, he won't want to fuck me. You have a comment. I feel bad that she never got him.
I mean, she does actually sleep with him once. She sleeps with him, or he sleeps with her.
Before, like off the page though.
Off the page, yeah.
During a time jump, we find out that he had chosen her during this ceremony.
Yeah.
And like now she just spends forever like chasing his approval,
pining after him. Yeah.
And
I felt kind of bad for her not getting to sleep with him because I wanted her to be happy.
You wanted her to get something that she chose.
Yes.
Which, hey, is a lot of this book, that whole concept. But that whole relationship or lack thereof bugged the shit out of me because it's so clearly like, even though theoretically anyone can choose to sleep with anyone else, and there's no concept of like sex shaming or anything. So like this society clearly approaches sex very differently from ours, but it still felt like he took advantage of her and used that to buy, not like coerce her loyalty. He turned her into an eager beaver because he had sex with her once and now she's constantly trying to prove herself for him to pick her again. And that felt very manipulative. And I can't tell if I'm putting my bullshit onto it or if this is just a society where everyone picks whoever they want. And yes, there's no consent, but also those dynamics don't matter. I don't know.
I think you're mostly bringing, in my opinion, is that you're mostly bringing your own spin to it. I thought that she wanted to sleep with him again because he was a good fuck and he was hot.
You didn't think there was any, like, he's the boss, and if he sleeps with me again, that means I'm doing a good job. It definitely felt like that to me.
I did think that it would have been a sign of his approval, or she thought that it would be a sign of his approval, but I didn't think that she wanted to sleep with him so that he would think that she was doing a good job.
Right. It felt like he used sex as a way to get her to try to prove herself.
Oh, no, I don't think that he was using it that way. I think she was responding that way.
Yeah.
But I don't think that he was intentionally doing it so that she would like crave sex with him as a sign of his approval.
I think that's true. But it's hard not to put, contemporary power dynamics onto characters that we're reading. And also, the society is so fucked up. It's weird to say, but they approached sex interestingly.
I mean, yes, I agree to both of those statements. But I do think that just because they had more of an open mind to sex in some regards than our society does, doesn't mean that their fundamental approach to sex wasn't horribly flawed, with the pillows having no agency, the people receiving the sex having no agency.
Well, pillows weren't the only ones receiving sex, though. That was like a separate thing.
No. Those were two separate.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And then I also had, for quite a bit of this book, very strong feelings about how Sabira has only had sex under these horrific circumstances, horrific to our sensibilities. Like, she doesn't see it that way. She's fine and as well adjusted as you can be being a slave and not realizing it. But then there's quite a bit of the book while she's going through the deprogramming and then never has sex again. And I'm like, but now we're coding sex as a thing that only bad people do. And I don't know how I feel about that, but Glosemeyer brought it back around. There is a couple who had been pillows, but they're part of this like freedom crew and have found love with each other. And at the very end, they proposition Sabira, and she's like, "You're not obligated. It's not your job anymore." And they said, "Yeah, we just like you." And so she finally has what I would call emotionally safe sex.
I mean, I would call that consensual sex, whereas I wouldn't call any of the other sex in this book consensual.
Yeah, well, between the two of them, whose names escape me, has always been fine. But like the fact that the main character never got her and Dagira, okay, the first time Sabira and Dagira hook up, you don't hear how silly that sounds, Sabira and Dagira.
I mean, no sillier than any other fantasy or sci-fi name pair.
All right. It's at, again, the ceremony, so not a lot of consent. But I feel like they choose each other afterwards.
They do, but can you really consent to something like that in that kind of society?
I didn't get the impression that non-pillows couldn't say no to each other. Obviously, if one of the overseers had said, but we don't even see overseers meddling with humans in that way.
I got the impression that you couldn't say no during the ceremony.
Yeah.
Afterwards, possibly. But I don't know. It's still pre-deprogrammed Sabira, still programmed Sabira. I feel like can't consent to having sex within that society in a way that I would consider consensual, because the whole society is so fucked up.
Maybe. I don't want to go that far because, just having no foibles around sex is a bad thing. Just because some of the sex is fucked up doesn't mean all of it is.
No, but I don't know. It feels like none of them can actually choose things. I don't know. It just, things are so regimented. Like, if her grandfather had said, "You can't have sex with this woman anymore," I think she would have stopped.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. But she and Daguerre do choose each other. It's true.
Yeah. And like that felt meaningful. And the fact that at the end they both choose not to kill the other also feels meaningful.
For me, it felt less meaningful while they were actually on the ship, because it felt more like something of convenience. And we don't see a lot of their relationship grow or develop. I mean, we see the start of it, and we see when they're on the ground and they've been in this relationship for some indeterminate period of time.
We don't get the impression that it's been very emotionally tender, though. They're still rivals. They just fuck now.
Yeah.
And I use that term very precisely. They're not making love.
No, they are not. They are not making love. They are indeed fucking.
I don't know. There's a lot going on. I think we need to see how that relationship arc finishes. Like we're basically halfway through right now, right? Like
I don't know if book 2 is the end of it.
Well,
I'm assuming it is, but I have no idea. I haven't done that much research.
I don't think I can. The beginning of it is fucked up. it might remain fucked up or it might have a wholesome ending. There's no way to know at this point.
I want it to have a wholesome ending.
Well, yeah, I want it to. So I mentioned how the beginning of this book reminds me of Starship Troopers, just because everything that the reader or the viewer engages with is so entrenched in this propaganda, basically. Propaganda feels like too small of a word for before the Shattered Gates of Heaven, but you know what I'm saying.
Cult?
This like very biased viewpoint.
Yeah, actually cult doesn't feel strong enough either.
No. But the second half, after Sabira has begun the deprogramming, it really reminds me of Frankenstein.
How so?
So Adam's storyline in Frankenstein, the monster, if you will, is all about the discovery that one's creator is not who you thought they were, and sort of coping with that, and how he had relied on his creator or expected his creator to be there for him and then wasn't, and how his reactions to that were really terrible and caused a lot of bad. And hey, we have to do a whole episode on Frankenstein, but there's a lot there with like the idea of your expectations for the universe and then having them fall short. And I think that really ties in with the deprogramming, because there are a lot of pretty straightforward, frankly, conversations about, well, if everything she has known until this point is wrong, what's the point of living any longer? Right? Sabira struggles with the idea that she had a place in the universe, and now she's being told that that place is fake. And even though she wants to be part of this free society, I mean, part of her clearly does, she leans into it. Part of her still would rather have the comfort of the familiar and the secure, because in that place, her creators are all-powerful beings with a plan who will take care of her instead of just being random aliens. And so that felt, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the Frankenstein comparison that you're making.
The comparison is more in vibes. The vibe
Themes.
check. Yeah. Themes, that's the literary word for it. It's true. And, you know, the two books introduce and handle it in very different ways. But those are conversations that both books have. And I think that ultimately was what tipped me over to, well, if this book reminds me of Frankenstein, it must be science fiction.
Fair.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right. This probably could have been in the non-spoiler section, but I cannot believe we have not brought up the Eashel yet.
The Eashel was so cute.
Yes. Oh, so Sabira gets kidnapped on this alien planet, rescued, kidnapped, whatever you want to call it, by humans.
A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
Yeah. It's a matter of perspective. So this planet have the Vleen?
Vlees, I think.
Vlees is the species that lives on this planet. And we see a couple of them, but we're also introduced to a resident pet of the temple that rescues/kidnaps Sabira. And it's extremely cute because all of the deprogrammed humans can't bring themselves to name a pet because, like, they're still dealing with having a name themselves, which I thought was horrifying and adorable at the same time.
It was a nice touch.
Yeah. This book is really consistent with that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so the species is an Eashel. It has little tendrils like all of the aliens, or like the main alien race has, and some little chubby little stubby little legs.
It's basically a space cat.
It's a space cat.
It's a space cat.
It knows to jump on the lap of and curl up on people who are going through a hard time, like a space cat.
One thing that I really liked.
It purrs.
Yes, like a space cat. One thing that I really liked was the imagery of the Vlees wearing a little respirator, or when they were all captured and brought back to the Theocracy's spaceship, just because I thought it, not that I thought that Eashel liked it particularly, because the Theocracy was not nice to anyone who was not like them, but Just I liked the consistency.
Um, actually, I think that was one of the temple's respirators because the Ishul ran around the whole temple, which was atmosphered for humans, not for Vlees.
Yes.
And I think it describes the like cute little collar with a little air spout into its mouth earlier on in the book.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. But we see, or I focused on the Ishul actually wearing the respirator when they got to the alien ship, to the Theocracy ship.
Oh, okay. I had read that as the alien, or not the aliens, the human slavers hadn't bothered to take off its respirator. And so they didn't choose, like, they didn't kill it. You thought that they put their own on?
No, no, no. What I'm saying is I thought that it was cute that the Ishul had a respirator.
Oh, okay.
That's the extent of my statement.
It was very cute. I agree with that.
And I liked the consistency.
Yes. And finding out that the Ishul was still alive was also a huge relief.
I would not have forgiven Glosemeyer if the Ishul had died.
No. I spent most of my time reading this book on my bed with both of my cats. So the Ishul was just like exceptionally gut-wrenching.
Yes.
Every time I did something cute, I had to pet the cats and go, yes, yes, that's you.
I did really like how this book makes me hope. I want reconciliation. I want all of the characters that Sabira cares for to end up deprogrammed and happy. And I don't think that's going to happen.
Even Spear?
Even Spear. I liked Spear. I mean, like, obviously he was a horrible, brainwashed human being.
He was a victim.
Yeah, but...
Which I really like how the free humans acknowledged that, like, these slaves did horrible things, but, like, that wasn't really them.
Yeah. And he does care for Sabira in his own way as much as he can within the confines of their society.
Yeah.
And Sabira cares for him. So, like, I want him to be deprogrammed and happy.
Him and Gabriel can have a reconciliation.
Yep.
I agree. I think out of all of the books that we've read that were just part one in a series, Tenlo also made me very much want more. But I think this is the book that makes me want more of this plot line without making me mad about where it cut off.
I do think that it's very nicely self-contained. Like, obviously, there's room for a second book, and there are some dangling threads. And you should read book 2. I'm assuming you should read book 2. We haven't read it yet, but we want to. But it does feel like you can stop at book 1 and, like, be content with the story that you have.
I could stop at book 1, but I don't want to.
Yes.
And that's a very special place.
Yes. And not a place that most books in a series end at, I think.
No. I think there's so much, like, gross marketing around cliffhangers and, well, you have to sell book 2 somehow, that really muddy the waters. I'm going to say it. I'm not shocked that the book that handles that the best was self-published. Like, there's no publishing gain here. It's just tell a good story.
Self-publishing does have less of that bullshit to deal with.
Or more if they're desperate to sell book 2 themselves. Self-publishing is not automatically better. I think it has a lot more freedom, and this is a really good example of an author using that freedom to its best extent.
At least, I guess what I'm trying to say is, at least with self-publishing, the drive to do that comes from you and not from external sources.
Yes, you could argue that money is an external source, but...
Okay, fair, but...
Or just readership, but, it's not always money. It's also just wanting to share your story. But I think Glosemeyer hits it right on the head with, I'm going to make people want to read more of the story by writing a really good story. Instead of manufacturing hooks. Like, there are hooks, like Dagira and Sabira. We have both talked about how we very much want to see where that goes. But the ending still feels good. It doesn't feel like it has just been put together to tug at our heartstrings.
I mean, it feels like an ending.
Yeah. If there was not a second book, I wouldn't be like, what the fuck?
Yeah. It feels like a movie that was made that hoped for a sequel but didn't know it would get one. So it was going to leave enough so that when a sequel was announced, you aren't like, what the fuck are they doing? But if a sequel is never announced, you aren't like, what the fuck are they doing?
Which is even more impressive because it's self-pub. The sequel is announced whether or not Glosemeyer feels like writing it. I think the only other book I can think of, Tenlo and also Legacy of the Brightwash. All three of these handle that really well, I think.
Brightwash ends on a pretty big cliffhanger.
Yeah, but the original mystery is solved.
Yeah, I mean, and Brightwash doesn't end on a cliffhanger where you think, oh, they're just trying to get you to buy book 2.
Yeah. I guess Tenlo is indie pub. Is it? It's Titan. Just kidding.
Oh, so I think Titan is technically an indie publishing.
Well, please Google that before I sound like an idiot.
Yeah, I think technically they're indie, but they're like super large indie.
Gotcha. Well, my statement stands. Art thrives when it is free. And I think that we are seeing that in the very biased examples I just pulled out of my ass.
Well, I won't argue with you because I think you're correct.
So, not to bring things back to work again, but there was a discussion around 401ks in my office from a professional telling us about what's going on with our 401ks. And she said that employees have the option, or employees may choose the default option. And I was like, why would I default on my 401k? It's not a loan. What are you talking about? And then I realized she meant default. The default option, which is a completely different word from default, which is what you do when you can't pay money back. No, there is absolutely no reason why I differentiate between these pronunciations, except that I'm not wrong.
I mean, I do think you're a little wrong. I think in American English, your use is more common, or your differentiation is more common. I certainly wouldn't have any kind of pause if she said default, if she was speaking in British English.
But in that case, default would be both versions, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, she was very American, so no.
But it could also, I don't know dialects well enough to say if the East Coast handles the two pronunciations differently.
Maybe. I guess it's a read and read situation where the pronunciation just changes the definition of the word. I guess read and read is not as dramatic as default and default, but...
And I do think that read and read like very definitely have two different meanings depending on the pronunciation. And I don't think that default and default do by default.
But you agree that those are two different words that exist. I'm not making that up.
I mean, the pronunciations, there are two different pronunciations.
And definitions. Like those are two different words.
The definitions are different, yes.
Even if you say default and default for both, those are still two different words.
Yes, they are two different words. Where I disagree with you is that they necessarily have different pronunciations.
No, I agree that it is probably... I'm not going to say that's a me thing. I can't be the only person.
No, I don't think it's a you thing, but I think it's a common thing and not an everyone thing.
Yeah, that's fair. I hadn't even realized I had that delineation in my head until I had to sit there going, why would she say that? And then I sort of had to sit there and unravel the fact that I defined these words by their definition, like so concretely, in a way that I hadn't realized was even in my brain before.
It is weird when we realize those little intricacies of like language nuance that we hold.
it was less. I mean, I figured out what she meant,
Well,
obviously.
obviously.
But then I had to go through, oh, I had to figure that out. She literally said the word she meant, but I could not understand it at all. So that was wild.
Sounds it.
Everyone should tweet at us whether they say default or default, but not actually say what they mean. And just write, yeah, I say default. I want to flood the fiction fans' Twitter with, I pronounce it default, and just no other context.
No pronunciation guide, just the word spelled out. Yeah, that would be great. Please don't do that.
It's very silly, but something about any conversation around pronunciation where they just write the word out is just so funny to me. I think I usually see it on purpose, right? Like if someone is typing and they say, oh, tomato, tomato.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. I don't know why that gets me so well, but it does.
I did appreciate that when you were explaining all of this to me after your 401k discussion, you did not do that, so I could actually figure out what you were saying.
Right, because I was trying to communicate effectively and not make a joke.
Yes.
I think it was D apostrophe fault versus capital DE fault.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that is how you did it.
Mm-hmm.
Except I think that if I had been doing it, I would have said DAHFAULT default instead of D apostrophe.
I can see that, but I wanted to get across how short, like where the stresses were on those syllables.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like default, DAH could have been read with like even stress. No one says it that way, so it wouldn't have. But my thinking was I wanted to show how short that first syllable was.
Whereas if I did it, I would be thinking I want to show how that first syllable is pronounced.
But there basically is no vowel. It's just default.
That lack is a vowel. It has a vowel sound. I think what I'm saying is we're both right.
Well, you can stick with that.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
We also have a Patreon, where you can support us and find our show notes and a lot of other nonsense.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye!
Bye!